final of the three-part history of Mille Lacs that I have. This period will be basically from about 1970 through about 2008. And it's actually when I actually worked here, so. One of the things I thought band assembly should do, and maybe each, like the judicial branch, the executive branch, and legislative branch, should have a couple copies of this that staff people could check out and read. This was done in 1984. It was written by Roger Buffalo Head. And then there was a committee put up by the band to review what was being put into the history. And it really gives a good history up until 1984. So it takes the band's history up until 1984 when it was published. And this was done through the Minnesota Chippewa tribe. Each reservation in the Minnesota Chippewa tribe had a history book produced about them. So they're out there somewhere. But they should have a couple of them in the office that staff people could check out or use as a reference. And I think Archives has a box full of these yet. We made a couple publications of it. The first one we sold out, and then the next one we had some extra, and I think they're down in Archives. And so I suggest that, you know, whoever handles the administration stuff in the legislative branch, if you have a couple of them that staff people can check out, because I know that that's something Sheldon wanted to do, was to have information for staff people to understand the history of the band better. And this would give you a really good review of the history up until 1984. What really needs to happen is the band needs to get somebody to write the history from 1984 to either 2000 or 2010 or 2020 now, that time period. While there's still people around who lived it, you know, who you could interview and talk to and discuss stuff with about what people were thinking and all that. Because right now there's, you know, that number of people is getting less and less. You know, and the new people now are being the history of the band. You know, the young people working here today, you're actually generating the history of the band each day, and somehow that needs to get recorded, because it's so hard to try to do it in the future looking back, because you can't talk to anybody, and you know, there's gaps, and you run across these things that you can't, oh gee, if I would only ask that question of this person. You know, and that's where I feel awful about the, you know, a lot of different things that I could have asked people questions about that I didn't know the question because I didn't know the history to ask. There was John Janke and Andrew Miigwech, who lived down by the marina. They got removed from Isle over here and had houses there, and they had a bunch of historical information that would have been really nice to talk to them. And when I first got here in 1970, they were still alive and still around, but I didn't know them. I didn't have, you know, any kind of communication with them. And one of them's namesake was Mizumane, so it would have been connected. You know, if we'd have known all that kind of stuff, you could have connected all these pieces together. I arrived at Mille Lacs Lake in 1973, and the first year I came here, I lived in Wakan, and I substitute taught in both Isle and Onamia. And it was kind of interesting substitute teaching because I always thought Isle was much better to work in than Onamia because there was such racist kind of behavior in Onamia that really didn't happen in Isle that I saw as much of. And there was a Nikolai was the principal in Isle at the time, and I just saw in the Mille Lacs Messenger he passed away just the other day. But he was kind of strict, but he was at least, I always felt, fair about things. And but you know, I never got that same feeling in Onamia that there was any fairness ever there. And the band had written a grant for support of the students going to Onamia. What had happened in 1970 was that right here was the Bureau BIA school. The school wasn't actually right here, it was over a little bit, but the house for the person who was the principal superintendent of the school lived right here. And that happened to be John Skoog, the last person who was here. And his wife is still alive, Gunn, and you know, somebody should interview her about her experience living here and her husband working with the school and what she thought about that. That would be a great history to record because nobody's going to have that information. And you know, when she passes away, that'll all be gone. And so that's just some. But anyway, they wrote a grant to have somebody tutor students in Onamia, and somehow somebody sent it to me because my background was in mathematics. And I went to school and had a graduate degree in mathematics, and I went back and worked on a master's degree in mathematics, so I knew a lot of math. And so I applied for the job, and I would call in, and somebody would answer the phone and say, and the contact person was Arthur Gobble, and that was, I had no idea who that was or what he did or anything, and I'd say, could I speak to Arthur Gobble? And they'd say, no. And they'd say, he's in Washington, D.C., he's in Santa Fe, he's in Portland, Oregon, he's in Denver. And finally, after a series of these calls, I just thought, he just doesn't want to talk to me. Nobody could be in all those different places, you know, that's not possible. He just doesn't want to talk to me and tell me I didn't get the job, you know. And then I came home from work. I was working road construction at the time. I came home from work and there was a note saying you got the job, start Monday. And this was like Thursday. And I felt, well, I have to give the guys I work for at least a week's notice. So Friday I rapidly called and said, you know, and they said, oh yeah, just come on the next Monday, if that works out better. And so I told everybody at work at the road construction, I'm quitting. Friday will be my last day, and everybody goes, yeah, 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 because in road construction, everybody's quitting all of the time because it sucks, you know? And that was just kind of the general thing that people say, I'm gonna quit this job and get a real job, you know? And never ever did. And so at the end of the day on Friday, I shook everybody's hand and said, nice working with you. And the foreman came up and he said, you really are quitting. And I said, yeah, I told you. He said, well, I didn't believe you. And so anyway, I drove over, and at the community center that used to be out across the street, right in the middle of the parking lot, the casino parking lot, and walked in there Monday morning at 8 o'clock and saw Cheryl Garble, who was secretary, and she said, yeah, you're at the right place. You go back and talk to a guy named Ted Matteau. and he was the director of this program. It was Title IV program of Indian education. And so I went back and saw him, and he said, yeah. And he said, it was kind of interesting in the interview he did with me, he said, so you want to teach these students math? And I said, well, yeah, that's what the job announcement said. And he said, no, I don't want you to do that. I want you to teach them welding. And I said, well, I can do that because as a construction worker, at the end of the season, I'd weld and fix equipment for the construction company for a couple months, and I do know how to weld, so I could teach some welding. And I said, but couldn't I also teach him math? And he said, no, I told you to teach him welding. And I said, okay, I'll teach him welding. If that's what you want, you're the boss, I'll do that. And I said, but maybe after I teach welding, I could teach him some math. And he got really mad. He says, don't you know that all Indians are good welders? I said, no, I don't know that. And he wanted to know if I had that stereotype that, you know, every Indian person was a good welder. And I just didn't, and I didn't know what he was talking about. And so he says, okay, that's fine, teach him math, and sent me off to Onamia to work in the high school. And so I worked in the high school in the fall of '74, and had a little office there, and I would help. Nancy was a student at that time. I think we had discussions about classes and different things. And
I left in '73
because
of that racism stuff.
Yeah, yeah, it was awful. For example, one day I was walking by, and the Phi Ed teacher, Tom Kane, walked into the lunchroom, and there were 3 girls sitting at a table. It was just before lunch, like 10 to 12 or something. He goes in there and he goes, what are you goddamn brown squaws doing in here? Get out of here, you have no business being in here. You're supposed to be in your class. And I heard that and I was just like, oh my God. And I went straight to the principal and I said, you wouldn't believe what the Phi Ed teacher just said. And I told him, and the principal looked at me and says, well, what were they doing in the lunchroom? All this other stuff, you know, was perfectly acceptable to him, and it just blew me away that blatant of racism could exist. And really, one of the other things that was going on there that stimulated this behavior was the athletic department and some of the other teachers had this deal with the football players, that if they had a student who misbehaved in their class, they would have the football players take them out to school, take and beat them up. And they'd laugh about it. This is our contract teaching. There was a process where you could contract with the student on their behavior and how to improve that so that they do better in school. Well, their version of contract teaching was they would put a contract on the student and have the football players beat them up if they didn't do what they were supposed to do in the classroom. And so by spring of that year, kids were carrying clubs and knives under their coats. And I told the principal, his name was Hopia, that you know, you got to do something because there's going to be violence here, because there's this craziness with everybody carrying weapons. And he reached over and opened his office door and looked out in the hallway. He says, looks fine to me. Shut the door. And at that time, the band, when it would write grants a lot of times, it was a last minute thing to get a grant in. And so in order to get it in time, they said, well, this grant for next year, we got to get it into Washington, D.C. by Friday. And we can't do it by mail because it won't get there by Friday. So we need somebody to fly it to Washington DC and deliver it before 4:30 on Friday afternoon. And so we're asking you to go do that. So they asked me to take this grant and deliver it to Washington DC on a Friday. And I said, well, do you think it'd be possible if I could stay and come fly back on Sunday? And they all looked at me like I was crazy and said, yeah, whatever you want to do, go ahead. And I thought, well, wow, I'll get to go to Washington DC. I'd never been to Washington DC, and I'll get to go there, and it'll probably be the only time in my life that I'll ever be in Washington DC. And so it'd be nice to spend a little time looking around while I'm there. And so I flew out Thursday night, got there on Friday, delivered the grant, and then I spent the next couple of days walking around Washington DC. I actually wore a hole in the bottom of my shoe, walking around, looking at everything I could take in, because I thought it'd be the only time I'd ever get there. Lo and behold, there were times when I was in Washington DC twice in the same day. I flew in the morning, went to meetings, flew back to Minnesota, and then flew back to Washington DC in the evening. And so it was kind of crazy in the sense, but when that was happening, I called back on that Friday and said, how are things going? And that's when the students walked out in Onamia, and that whole process then started about how do they deal with this. You know, there was a lot of people denying there was any racism in the school. There were big meetings, the media took it on, and it was published all over about the walkout and racism and the civil rights. ACLU came in, and we had lots of people, discussions and big meetings in Onamia to talk about what was happening. What we did was we took the old school that had been closed in 1970, and in the consolidation of schools in Minnesota, we opened up that and made classrooms, and we started the tribe started its own school here with various people, and I taught math, which was one of the things that, so I was a math teacher and different people were English teachers and so on. And then what happened was they started, the school district didn't want to have a separate, Onamia School District didn't want to have a separate school system here. So they hired somebody named Bob Speed, and Bob Speed started a school within a school and created a system of education where there would be a school within a school, and basically they moved some trailers behind the school, and that was the school within a school. It was outside the school, but in the school. And so that worked for about 3 years, where students would go in and go within the school, and then come back out for cultural activities here. And one of the cultural activities they did was in the fall, they were taking the guys out, the young men out to go deer hunting. And during that one trip, somebody had a loaded gun in the car, and it went off and blew out the back window of the van. And it was like, oh wow, we can't do this anymore. I mean, just so lucky that nobody got killed. I mean, it just blew the window right out the back of the van, you know. So that was some of the things that went on with the school within the school that was pretty crazy and pretty dangerous in some senses. But they tried to do cultural programs out here, and then to help expand that, they wanted non-tribal students to come out and go to and do some of the cultural programs, and there were students that did that. but it didn't really work very well. So in 1978, the Bureau of Indian Affairs started something called Bureau Contract Schools. And this was created under the 1975 Indian Education Act that allowed tribal, it was called 1975 Indian Education and Self-Determination Act was the full act. And it allowed for the development of educational programs, but it also allowed tribal governments to contract services that the Bureau of Indian Affairs provided to tribal members. In some cases, like on South Dakota, some of the reservations, for every tribal person, there was one Bureau staff person. It was that heavy of an administration. So there was that many bureaucrats working, providing services for tribal people, that it was a one-on-one deal. And it wasn't working. I mean, tribal people weren't getting any services. So to help combat that, they were allowing tribal governments to contract the services that the Bureau of Indian Affairs was providing for reservations. And that's what the Indian Self-Determination Act of 1975 did. And one of those was school programs. The Bureau ran school programs. Up to 1970, the Bureau of Indian Affairs ran the elementary school here on the reservation. But with the consolidation of the school in Minnesota, that was all transferred to Onamia in 1971 and started. And by 1975, there was this walkout and separation again of the school systems. This is one of the things I wanted to talk to because it came up in 1975. There was a fella here named Fred Nickaboyne, and he worked at the community center. He was basically a janitor. And Onamia had written a grant very similar to what the reservation had written to provide, to get money to provide services to tribal students. And they developed a reading program. And there was a lady, Eugenia McGrath, who was a reading teacher that was hired under that program in Onamia. She actually had went to Morehead State, where I went to college, and I'd known her, kind of just knew who she was. And anyway, she ended up going out with Ted Matteau originally, and then with A.J. Nickaboyne, and then finally with Fred. And she had a cabin she was renting at West Shore, and her and Fred moved in there. And then something happened, and she got upset, and she called her ex-husband. She had been divorced from him for over 7 years. He was a professor at Morehead State. He was a famous kind of conscientious objector. He started conscientious objecting activities in the Second World War to be pacifist and nonviolence, and then it expanded in the Vietnam War, and he was renowned for his conscientious objection to violence. So she calls him up. He goes to a neighbor and borrows a gun, drives clear across the state and comes here on Friday evening. Fred comes to the house at 10 o'clock at night, or the cabin, and he shoots Fred and kills him. And I just told all the people here, well, that guy's going to jail forever. You can't do that. That's premeditated murder, to borrow a gun from somebody, drive 150 miles and shoot somebody. And all the elders told me, nothing's going to happen. And I said, well, that's just not possible. That's not gonna. And so this guy, this McGrath, spent one night in Mille Lacs County Jail, and that was it. There wasn't even a trial. And, you know, we think about George Floyd and some of that stuff now. There was stuff going on here that was just awful. And anyway, that's why I wanted to include that, because it's something that happened here about justice and just the level of awfulness that I couldn't even believe that was. And yeah. So in 1978, the Bureau of Indian Affairs came to Mille Lacs, to Art and to Henry Davis, and said, you should start a contract school to take over the functions of the school within a school. And as part of that, Henry Davis came over to my house and asked me if I would be the principal of that school. And I said, well, I'm not a principal, I'm a math teacher. And they said, no, we want you to be the principal. So I said, okay, I'll start it and we'll see how it goes. And so in the fall of 1979, we started Neashing School. And it was a Bureau contract school. And one of the things that we needed to do the contract school is we needed a contract, which was about this thick. It was a government contract, a federal government contract, that you were providing services, educational services to the students on the Mille Lacs Reservation. And that required, you know, all this formality of a contract. And so there was lots of things that was involved in. One of the real difficulty things was that you had to spend the money to provide the school services, and then you'd get reimbursed by the Bureau of Indian Affairs. So you were always in the hole, essentially, because you take, and you get quarterly reimbursements. So as you provided services, run the school, after you had 4 months of that, you could then submit a request for reimbursement, and then theoretically the Bureau would reimburse you that money, and then you could do the next 3 months. The problem is if the Bureau got mad at you, or if the Bureau decided that they didn't have the money or whatever, they wouldn't reimburse you right away, and then you were stuck with no money to provide what was going on. And there was a number of Bureau programs that the band was implementing. And so there was all these kinds of requests for reimbursement, some in, and so one of the things I tried to do with the school was I tried to build up a fund, at least 1/4 of the expenses annually up front. So I had the money so that when at the end of the quarter, I was zero. I wasn't in the hole, I was zero, and so hopefully the next money would come in before I needed the next, you know, to pay people. It got so bad here with the band, actually, at one point in time, that the banks closed all the band's accounts, and people got their paychecks and the banks would cash them. And that was a financial headache there. but that, you know, so that was, and that really created havoc, because everybody was mad, because, you know, you had a check and you couldn't cash it. When will you be able to cash it? And all these kinds of things. So we had to work all through that, but the whole band government was frozen. The accounts were all frozen by the banks. So a lot of these things led to looking at the government system that operated here. And the system was a reservation business committee, and we talked a little bit about that. And the business committee came out of the 1934 Indian Reorganization Act, but it became the government structure for the band. And so everything that happened had to go through the RBC. If you wanted something done, it had to go through the RBC. Janitor needed to be fired, had to go through the RBC. Nobody would make that decision independently of firing the janitor, even though the janitor hadn't come to work for the last 2 weeks. Nobody would say, okay, that's enough, you're done. And ultimately went to the chairperson at the RBC. So when the janitor needed to be terminated because he didn't show up, or for whatever reason, the chairman had to make that decision, which created all kinds of problems. You know, it was political manipulation, there was all kinds of internal dynamics that went on with firing of people. At one point in time, there was a local education committee that oversaw the program that I worked under. And there was a workshop, and the staff had all went to the workshop and then decided, well, we probably aren't coming back to work right away. But nobody told me that, so I went back to work the next day. And then the chairman of the local education committee said, where is all these guys? I said, well, they decided they were, basically they partied. And they knew that was going on, and so they said, okay, you gotta deal with that, me. And I said, me? I'm a staff person. And they said, well, you're getting promoted, and we want you to fire them all. And I said, well, I don't know about that, you know. And they said, nope, that's your job. You send them all a letter terminating them. So I wrote out a letter, not knowing anything about administration of stuff, and sent these guys termination letters. Needless to say, that got everybody's attention, and they all came back and said, no, we were on vacation. And I thought, oh man, am I in trouble. Anyway, it all got worked out. They got their job back. I didn't get fired for sending out letters, but it was kind of a mixture of everything. And at that time, the only person who really wasn't involved in partying to a great degree was Maggie Sand. She was secretary treasurer. Otherwise, everybody else loved to party. And these parties would go on for 3-4 days. And so you'd come to work and you couldn't get in the government center because everybody was out. And that's how, you know, it was pretty difficult sometimes. And then it seemed like about every couple of months you had to tear a door off of one of the buildings because somebody lost keys and nobody had keys to get in the building, so you had to take the door off to get into the center to make things happen.
The community center?
The old community center.
Or the pole barn?
Yeah, the old community center. So it was, you know, there was lots of struggles, and gradually, you know, the council people stopped partying, and they followed Maggie's example and gave up on that, and things started to function better. But it was a very difficult environment for a while about how things functioned and what was going on. One of the things we had with the start in the Oshing School was we had to work on accreditation because everybody was saying that if you graduate students from the Oshing School, they won't be able to go to college because nobody's going to accept a Oshing diploma as a valid diploma to go to college. And what we ended up doing was getting the school accredited through North Central Accreditation, which is basically where all schools get accredited through in the United States, showing that they had adequate curriculum and teaching staff to provide a reasonable education and a diploma. And so we went through and started the process of being accredited. One of those processes of accreditation required an administrator who was trained in school administration. I was a math teacher. I wasn't a school administrator, even though I was doing the administration. So I went to Art and I said, Art, you need to fire me because we need to have a principal who's accredited for operating a school. And I'm not that, and I don't plan to go back and get a certificate or a degree in school administration. And he said, well, let me think about that. And he says, I want you to find a different solution. And so one of the things, I had a friend, his name was Andy Lawson. He was a Tsimshian Indian out of Alaska, but he was a professor at St. Cloud State. And he had a degree in school administration. And so we had him come in as a school administrator to handle some of the administration. And in exchange, he got to bring his classes up to come and observe the reservation and have some understanding about what was going on the reservation. And so he liked it, and it worked out for us. And then Art suggested that I spend some time researching the history of the reservation. And he told me to take a three-month leave of absence and work on the history of the reservation. And that's when we put together about the treaties, which treaties the band signed, who Shibashkin was. We found a picture of Shibashkin. Rosemary Christensen was a Mille Lacs tribal member who ran the Indian education program for Minneapolis school systems. She had a staff person working for her in graphic arts, and she needed some money to send him to France to learn more art. And that was Steve Primo. And so I came up with $2,000 to give to the Minneapolis Indian Education Program, which ultimately went to Steve Primo to send him to France. In exchange, Steve Primo agreed to draw the leaders of the band, and that's where those, like the picture of Shibashkin and the different tribal leaders historically in the past that Steve Primo did, came from, and how that got done. And so those are kind of the first time their band members saw historically who the leaders were that signed, like the Treaty of 1855 that created the reservation. It wasn't complete. We missed Manomanike rice maker, but we started that process of getting people to understand historically who was tied to the reservation, how things had happened. I prepared a report for Art, and then he asked me to spend another 3 months and go into bigger detail about the treaties and what the treaties guaranteed and that type of stuff. And so I spent another 3 months doing that. In 1979, these are kind of the programs that the band operated. It had wildlife and parks. That was a wildlife, it was a natural resource program that the band had. It had one game warden. The Minnesota Chippewa tribe had passed an ordinance about hunting and fishing on Mille Lacs Reservation that was the guideline for that. We had a public works. We had something called Indian Action Team. Indian Action Team was training young people to be carpenters, and they built a lot of housing. Sometimes it wasn't exactly square, but it was housing. And so there was things to be learned. The marina complex was developed. Down at the Marina, the powwow grounds, there used to be like 12 cabins there, modern day cabins. There was a laundromat, a grocery store, a marina bar and restaurant. All of that was operating down there. There was a Head Start program. There was a construction company, Mille Lacs Construction. They built houses, they did government jobs. There was a government center, and that whole program ran for under $2 million. That was the band's budget back in 1979.
How many total employees would that have been back then?
Oh, there was probably 80. I did, at that time, I looked at, you know, the number of employees, the different things. 80% of the band employees were still in poverty because the salaries were so low. So of the employees that worked for the band, even though they had a full-time job, they were still considered poverty because the salaries were so low. From 1979 through 1989, my salary stayed exactly the same for that 10-year period. Actually, it went down a little bit, but it was only a few $100s. But that, my salary for that 10-year period never saw an increase for that 10 years because there was just no money. And if I gave myself a raise, that means I took money from some employee. They wouldn't get a raise, or their salary would actually go down. And it was very difficult to budget and to deal with these things. So in 1979, the Bureau, under self-determination, put on a workshop. A guy named Rex Mayotte was the superintendent at the Cass Lake Agency. And he put on a presentation about tribal governments, how tribal governments should act, and sovereignty, tribal sovereignty. And Art, Doug Sam, Henry Davis went to that workshop, and they came out all fired up about changing the way tribal governments operate, and particularly about implementing various aspects of tribal sovereignty. The Minnesota Chippewa tribe tried to do a constitutional revision in 1981, and Mille Lacs presented to the Minnesota Chippewa tribe a separation of powers scheme of government for the Minnesota Chippewa tribe, where the TEC would essentially be the legislative body, the president would be the executive body, and that whole process. When they presented that to the TEC, nobody listened to them. Doug Sam got very mad because he'd spent a lot of time putting that all together again. They picked up the documents and left the meeting. Art and Doug left. And went back to Mille Lacs and said, we're going to implement that here. And so that was the beginning of separation of powers at Mille Lacs. One of the things that happened was in 1982, there were commissioners appointed. Henry Davis was the Commissioner of Administration. Raymond Kaeg was Assistant Commissioner. Mabel Sam Smith was Commissioner of Health and Human Services. Leonard Sam was Commissioner of Corporate Affairs. I was Commissioner of Education. There wasn't a natural resource department at that time yet. Even though we had a program, there wasn't a department of natural resources. The Band Assembly, or the RBC, passed an ordinance 0381. That might be one of the documents that you might want to post up. In September 29, 1981, they created the executive branch of government within the Mille Lacs Band. And then following that, so in that would have happened in 1981, and in February of 1982, they created the band assembly by ordinance. They divided up the reservation business committee and created this executive branch and a legislative branch by resolution or ordinance. And then in 2000 or 1983, they created the judicial branch of government, the three branches. And those are all done through ordinances. There was a lot of discussion about whether that should require a constitution development, a band constitution to do that, or whether to do that through ordinance the way it was. And so they set up these ordinances so that it was very difficult to change them. And they provided public hearings and testimony on those, and ultimately decided that that's how they would proceed. They never held a referendum on that issue of separation of powers, but they did provide this long time interval where people could comment, raise issues about it, and there was never any significant resistance to that, except from the other tribes. The Minnesota Chippewa tribe took great offense to this. They tried to freeze funds that Mille Lacs was getting from the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And this is where Steve Tibbetts came in preventing the other tribes from stopping Mille Lacs from getting funding when they developed this separation of powers ordinances. And so that's why he had this special recognition in Bath, because he really kind of stood up against the other tribes in Mille Lacs' attempt to develop this separation of powers. At the same time, President Reagan came out with an Indian policy, one of the few tribe or presidents that actually had an Indian policy. That Indian policy identified that tribal government should develop separation of powers, form of government, and try to expand their government program and services through a separation of powers form of government. One of the people that helped in drafting that Indian policy for President Reagan was a lady named Fran Air. And she was a lawyer, a DC lawyer, and she was very well connected with the political arms that ran through Washington, D.C. One of the other things that was happening while this was all going on, there was this really tremendous conflict between the Minnesota Chippewa tribe and Mille Lacs. The rest of the bands trying to stop funding to Mille Lacs, saying Mille Lacs was a renegade and trying to create this new form of government. A lot of pressure was put on, and so the band one of the things they thought of doing, and this was supported by the legal firm that the band had hired, which was Science Chestnut in Seattle, was to separate from the Minnesota Chippewa tribe with congressional authority. So a bill was developed, and it was introduced by Senator Boschwitz that would separate Mille Lacs Band from the rest of the Minnesota Chippewa tribe. And as part of that separation, they had a referendum vote here on the reservation about whether people believed that Mille Lacs should separate from the Minnesota Chippewa tribe or not. And the vote was tied, even, like I think it was 171 to 171. It was a really strange outcome as a result. But that pretty much ended the talk of separating from the Minnesota Chippewa tribe at that time. The membership just didn't show that they really were interested in doing that. about the development of the natural resource program. As I said, there was a natural resource code that the Minnesota Chippewa tribe had developed. And then in 1981, some band members were down at the marina, had nets set out in the spring of the year, and were taking fish. And this was kind of an ongoing issue in the spring of the year. Tribal members would net fish, and there were some members that would sell fish to people, and there was this big push and shove about who got fish and who didn't, and could you do that and couldn't do that. Anyway, in the process, somebody brought a gun. Actually, it was Fred Jackson. He was an old man. And when the DNR came dragging the lake to pull these nets, he shot in front of the canoe with the shotgun. And this created a huge explosion. Law enforcement came in from every direction, and they raided the marina bar. They had everybody spread up against the walls. It's really lucky nobody got shot. And ultimately, Conrad Kegg was arrested for shooting at the DNR and went to prison. But he actually wasn't the fellow who did it. And I don't know what kind of counsel he had or representation, but he ended up in prison for a number of years because of that. And it wasn't him that actually had shot. And later Fred acknowledged that he had been the one who had shot the DNR. So in 1983, Art asked me to give up the Commissioner of Education position and become the Commissioner of Natural Resources for the band and develop that program. And so I agreed, and I became the Commissioner of Natural Resources. I don't know if you can read this or not, but we used to have something called the Letter of Credence. And as a commissioner, you got this letter from the chairman saying that you had authority to speak for the band. And wherever you were supposed to go and talk, you were supposed to present this letter of credence to the group so that they know you were officially spokesperson for the band. And before that, different people would say, well, I speak for the Mille Lacs Band, and they would go out and say stuff that was or was not true, and then the band had to deal with all that. So these letter of credences were put together. I had no idea what a letter of credence was when I got this, what it meant, what to do with it. Jay Canasatega, who I think some of you were here, part of his presentation, and he had come up with this letter of credence idea. Initially, it was like so weird to walk into a meeting and hand out this letter to say, this is who I am, and they could make copies of it, but they couldn't keep the original. And so you had to keep track of that. And it was, because nobody did that. I mean, it was, you know, no tribe did it, whatever. But it was actually a good process, and it helped make things more formalized in meetings and stuff. The state of Minnesota, for example, when I became Commissioner of Natural Resources for the band, would never send me a letter that said Commissioner Wedll or Natural Resource Commissioner Wedll. He would always be Don Wedll, Director of Natural Resources. They'd never use the title of Commissioner. And the internal working said, you have to force them to use that title, use Commissioner. You know, now it's readily accepted that the commissioners of the band are acknowledged as commissioners, and it's not an issue. But originally it was a big issue, and people didn't accept that. So in '83, I took over natural resources. Gene Reynolds was the game warden for the band. And one of my first jobs was raising money to support the department because there was no money. And ultimately, there were two things that I was directed to do. One was to litigate the band's treaty rights, and the second was to protect the band's land and resources. And one of the litigation issues that was very difficult is that we had to show that we had an enforcement authority to enforce laws that we developed. And so that meant we had to develop laws regulating natural resources, and then we had to enforce it. And one of the things that they wanted in that law, original law, was to prevent netting in the spring of the year. And so, as a part of my job was to arrest tribal members who were illegally netting in the spring of the year against band law, which wasn't much fun. And many band members got very upset. And I know one time we confiscated a canoe and some nets, and I went to work the next day, and Raining Boy called me up and said, "Don," he said, "do you have anybody at your house?" And I said, "No, there's nobody at my house." And he said, "Well, there's quite a bit of smoke coming from over in that direction, so you might want to check." And it just happened that one of the game wardens was driving by, and I said, I called him on the radio, I said, "Are you on by my house?" And he said, "Yeah, I'll be there in a minute." I said, "Well, check and see what's going on. There's supposed to be a lot of smoke." Anyway, the canoe that we had confiscated was chained to a tree there. It had been cut loose and taken, and everything was set on fire around my house. And it just happened that the game warden was there and was able to get the garden hose and spray everything down and prevent everything from burning up. But those were kind of the early days of enforcing tribal codes against tribal members, and there was a lot of opposition to that. Another time, one of the members that was charged with that tried to push me out into the highway from behind with the car. So we had lots of fun. The other thing that we had, and this involved about the protection of band resources. One of the lakes that tribal members loved to harvest wild rice was Dean Lake. And band members were constantly telling me that the lake was being destroyed because people were harvesting rice too early there. So in the fall of 1983, I took a band elder out to Dean Lake, and we looked at the rice, and I went out and gathered a little rice in the canoe and asked him to tell me how long it should be closed before he thought it would be ready to pick. And he said, "Oh, about a week." And it was going to open the next day by the state. And he said it should wait at least a week before you go out there. And so I issued an order, a commissioner's order, which were brand new things. The commissioners had authority to issue orders to protect resources of the band, or in education or other types of things. So I issued an order closing the lake that went to this Dean Lake for harvesting wild rice, and gave it to the warden, and they cut down a tree and dropped it across the road, and we put band signs on there, or federal, it was trust land that this road went across, and we put Bureau of Indian Affairs signs saying no trespassing till further notice. The next day those signs were gone, the log was gone, and the state game wardens were out there trying to hold the road open. So we went to Fleet Farm and bought a farm gate and posts and went out there, put the posts in, chained the gate shut, and said, that's that. There's no crossing that until the end of a week's time. The state commissioner of natural resources got very mad and decided to bulldoze a road different than the road used to get to Dean Lake. And he miscalculated and hit some private land before he got to the Dean Lake. And the private owner got very mad and sued the state for damaging his property. And so the road remained closed. Then the AG's office and ricers, non-Indian ricers, got together and sued the band for $6 million for the failure, for the prevention of them from harvesting wild rice. That's what they said they lost in value from the wild rice on Dean Lake. What was interesting was everybody was named. Art, the band council was, legislative body at that time, was all named on this complaint except for me. I was the one who posted the commissioner's order closing the road. My name was on there, but they never named me in the lawsuit. And Henry and Leonard Sam and just about anybody who was around got named in this lawsuit except for me. And so then everybody said, well, we know what that is. You're a white guy. So it was really funny, you know. But anyway, this went into state court. The judge happened to be the lawyer for the school district in Onamia during the walkout. And he was a really awful guy. And so he was just happy as a little pig in the mud with this lawsuit where he had some control. And Al Zients came in from Seattle and listened to the case for about, maybe 20 minutes and said, that's it. We're removing this case to federal court. And left. And we withdrew the case from state court. It went into federal court in Duluth. Ultimately, the case got dismissed because no one could on federal land, you have to have a valid easement for a road. And since there wasn't a valid easement on this property, you couldn't claim that you had a right to a road by adverse possession. And so the case got dismissed because nobody could determine whether that road was legitimate or not because they couldn't adversely possess against the United States government. So that's how it got dismissed. And I did know that there wasn't a valid easement on the road when I issued the order, because if there would have been, then we probably couldn't have been able to block it. But ultimately, that set in place a lot of stuff about natural resources that moved forward after that. We actually found who took the signs that said these are federal lands and to violate, dispose of these signs as a federal offense. The state game wardens took them. I tried to get the field solicitor's office to charge them for the taking of these signs, and they just laughed at me. Said, there ain't no way we're doing that. So that's how much power the state had over tribal issues and even over federal issues in regards to these kinds of things. One of the things that I was supposed to do as commissioner was to litigate the band's treaty rights. And in that process, Art said in a meeting, he said, I want the best. We said, well, we don't have any money to hire any attorneys, so we'll use legal aid. He said, absolutely not. You are not using legal aid to litigate the band's treaty rights. He said, I want the best law firm in the country to be hired to do that. And we all looked at each other like, okay, who's that? You know, he says, I want you to find who that is. And so we went out and we came up with Zion's Law Firm. And they were in Seattle, Washington. They handled the Bolt decision. It was an off-reservation case in Washington and Oregon. And that was called the Bolt decision that they won. And so they were hired, and the band then proceeded to look at how to litigate or what to litigate in regards to the treaty rights it had. They recommended that we take the 1837 case and litigate that. That was their recommendation. Simultaneously, in Wisconsin, there were two cases going on that tribes filed in Wisconsin. One was a case called the Baker case, where who owned the beds of the lakes within the reservation. So if you had a reservation and you had a lake, who owned the bed underneath the water on that land? And the state of Wisconsin claimed that they owned it, and the tribe claimed that it owned it. The second case was an off-reservation hunting and fishing case that two LCO members had went out fishing off-reservation and got cited for hunting or fishing off-reservation, and that was the second case. That was called the Voigt case. Art wanted the Minnesota Chippewa tribe to intervene in both of those cases, and Kent Tupper, who was the tribal attorney at the time, declined, saying, no, those are both losers, we can't get involved in that. And Art got really mad and said, well, we were gonna get involved. And anyway, the Baker case, the band Mille Lacs didn't get involved with. We lost, or Wisconsin tribes lost that case. The state of Wisconsin owns the beds of those under the lakes, even if they're in the reservation. But the off-reservation case, the Voigt case, the Wisconsin bands won. And so in the fall of '84, there was a meeting in Cable, Wisconsin, with all the tribes involved in the Voigt decision. And Art and I went over to that meeting. We listened all day long to the presentations that were made about what this case meant and all this. And at the end of the day, Art asked, he said, is Mille Lacs included in this case? And all the tribal chairmen sitting there looked at each other and they were going, well, does Mille Lacs live in the ceded territory? And Art said, yep. And he said, well, then you're involved. And he says, okay, that's what I wanted to know. And he said, and then he pointed to me and said, he's gonna be the guy who will be here representing the band in the Voigt case. And so I was involved then in the Voigt litigation in Wisconsin, and in particular the negotiations of how to implement the Voigt case in Wisconsin. And one of the things I tried to ensure is that Mille Lacs band members could go to Wisconsin and hunt and fish. And so there were many, many hours of negotiations with the state of Wisconsin, and that could be a whole day's lecture in itself about how those things happened and what went on there. One of the things the Mille Lacs band needed in order to litigate the off-reservation case, and we had to litigate it separately, even though the Voigt decision was settled in Wisconsin. Mille Lacs, the Wisconsin is in the 7th Circuit Court of Appeals and the 7th Judicial District, and we're in the 8th Judicial District. So because we were in the 8th, the state of Minnesota got to relitigate the issue and weren't bound by the 7th decision. And so one of the things that the law firm said we needed was a $500,000 war chest to litigate this case out. And $500,000 was a lot of money at that time. for us to come up with. But that was one of the things. And every year at the State of the Band, Art would direct me to proceed with litigation of the 1837 treaty right as a directive for that year. And every year I wouldn't do it because I didn't have the money to litigate it. And gradually I saved up from various things. One example was EPA was awarding tribes a grant of $50,000 if they would study a proposal to create a nuclear repository for nuclear waste. And so we signed up and got a grant. I had people hired, but I didn't pay them because they volunteered to write the grant, and we got a check for $50,000 from EPA for looking at the study of nuclear waste. And that went into that war chest. So that was kind of the way we built that fund, was through processes like that. As this was going on, we had some EPA grants, we had draft ordinances, and we also needed to have the Bureau of Indian Affairs support this litigation of 1837. And that required to go through the agency, to go to central office. At central office, or at the area office in Minneapolis, they sent the request over to the solicitor's office to ask them to review the band's rights. And as that proceeded, then that request to the solicitor's office went from the Minneapolis office to Portland office to central office, back down, and said, yeah, the band's probably got these rights. And then the band could proceed to request the U.S. to intervene in that case. That took something like 10 years to get that to occur, for the United States finally agreed to intervene in the case. One of the things about the State of the Band addresses, and we talked a little bit earlier about it, but the State of the Band was something totally new for us. And in fact, in all of Indian country, no tribe was providing a state of the reservation or the State of the Band. And so when the band in 1984, Art presented the first State of the Band address, the area director, who was Earl Barlow, said that this is going to be the future for tribes. That tribes will now start presenting State of the Reservation or State of the Band addresses for their membership. And it actually has happened. One of the State of the Band addresses in 1986 was closed to everybody except band members and some staff. And at that time, Art presented in the State of the Band all the debt that different people had to the band. And it was particular band members who had run up bills and hadn't paid the band back for costs that they had incurred. And so he read off the names of everybody, if it was $10 or $12,000, he read off their names, and he made people mad. There was yelling and screaming going on, and he even had his own name in there, how much he owed. But they read it all off and said, we need to deal with this, and we need to figure out what we want to do. And a couple men, Henry Davis, one of them, stood up and said, we want you out of there. This is wrong that you release this information, and we want you out. And Art said, he said, okay, he said, if that's what you want, he said, everybody who wants me out, stand up, and I'll leave right now. And I thought, oh no, because people were really bad. And so Henry stood up, and a couple other men stood up, And George Badowski, and most of you don't know him, but he was a medicine man here. He looked over and he said, "Sit down." And these guys, I mean, Henry was a Vietnam soldier. He was a tough guy. He dropped in that chair like a little kid. He didn't bat an eye. He just sat right down when George said, "Sit down." And Art says, "Well, I don't see anybody standing, so we're going to proceed." And they proceeded, but it was a tense moment in the State of the Band addresses that was going on. One of the things that happened in 1984, 85, was the band was getting money from the state of Minnesota through grants. About a third of the band's budget was from state grants from the state of Minnesota. The state of Minnesota had started to insert in these grants language that said, in order to receive this money, the band will give up all its constitutional rights, U.S. constitutional rights. It will give up all treaty rights. It will agree to be subject solely to the laws of the state of Minnesota. And tribes were signing these. And in 1985, Art looked at him and said, "No, I ain't signing this anymore," and refused to sign it. And some of us said, "We're going to lose a third of our budget." He says, "Yeah, but we ain't giving up our rights." And so that day in September, we laid off 1/3 of all the employees in the band. So if you think about what that would look like, is laying off 1/3 of the employees, that was a pretty big deal, and that created just tremendous turmoil. The state AG's office tried to manipulate that because they liked that language, tried to manipulate that and told people who were supporting wanting this state money that if they formed a group, they would give them the money and not the tribal government, and then they could distribute that money to band members. And some of us realized that if the state pulled that off, that would literally undermine the tribal government forever, because you would have, anytime you'd have some confrontation with the state would create a new group and fund them, and you'd be out. It was kind of like when the RBC was created under the Indian Reorganization Act, that the traditional chiefs lost authority because the Bureau would only fund the business committees. So we stopped that organizing tribal members and wouldn't allow them to meet on the reservation. And that kind of undermined that whole position. And then we had to conduct public meetings explaining why the band wasn't signing these state contracts. And at one of these meetings, I was making the presentation. The District 2 representative came in, pounded on the table, saying, "You," pointing at me, "need to sign these agreements so that band members get this money." And we had just got done explaining why it was a bad idea to sign these things. And I said, "Well, you know, I'm not putting my name on those documents because I don't want 20 years from now somebody to say Don Wedll gave away the band's rights by taking the state money." I said, "You're a district rep. If you want, you can sign those documents." And they refused to do that and went storming out of there. But it was one of those turbulent times when things went going on. Ultimately, what happened to resolve that was Chuck Davis, who was the local senator, state senator here, at a meeting one day, he came up to me and I think David Abbott and said, "Why aren't you guys taking state money?" And we said, well, this is why, and we laid it out. And he said, well, that doesn't make any sense. You shouldn't have to do that in order to get state money. I'll write a bill and we'll pass a law that prohibits that. And we said, great, that would really help. And so he disappeared, and pretty soon there was a bill written talking about how the bands in Minnesota should not have to waive sovereign immunity in order to receive state grants. That's basically the sentence. And so this started to move through the state legislature. And at some point, it stopped. And I called the staff person and said, why is this bill stopped? And he said, well, the House side is holding it up. And the House representative was a guy named Jerome Peterson. Jerome Peterson's wife worked for the AG's office. The AG's office was opposed to the bill, so that stopped it. And so I asked, well, what's their concern? And he says, well, their concern is that the Mille Lacs Band would block off Highway 169, and there wouldn't be anything anybody could do about it because sovereign immunity. And the second reason is somebody could come onto the reservation and fall down and get hurt, and the band could apply sovereign immunity and they couldn't sue the band, and so they couldn't get any recourse for being hurt by falling on the reservation. I said, well, the second one is pretty easy because we have insurance that covers that. And if somebody falls, you know, the insurance will cover that. I said, now, if it goes beyond, the claim goes beyond what the coverage is, then maybe the band might apply sovereign immunity. But other than that, they would be compensated up until the cap of the insurance. And he said, could you send me that insurance policy? And I said, yeah. And I said, the second thing is, why would the band block Highway 169 when in fact in 1855 they spent $5,000 of their money to build Highway 169, or predecessor to it, from Minneapolis up here? And I said, and even if the band did block 169, how long do you think it would take before that road would be back open? 2 hours at the most? He said, yeah. And so we gave him the insurance thing. He got so mad because the AG's office had lied to them that the bill went through and became law, and it's still law today. So bands in Minnesota don't have to waive sovereign immunity in order to get state funding anymore. Another issue we looked at was Public Law 280, which provides law enforcement on reservations. Originally, before 1950, law enforcement on reservations was provided by the federal government. After 1950, some states, under Public Law 280, that federal jurisdiction was transferred to the state governments. And in Minnesota, the Minnesota Chippewa tribe supported that transfer of Public Law 280 to the state, partially because it was so difficult to get federal enforcement done on the reservations. But one of the things that happened was that state governments weren't getting any tax base from reservation lands. And so counties were refusing to enforce on reservation unless it happened to be a non-tribal person involved in it. If it was two tribal people, they generally ignored it. And that was because they felt that they weren't getting enough money. So there was some state money that came in, and it provided to hire tribal members to be county deputies, essentially. And two of those original county deputies was Richard Wias, and the second one was Gene Reynolds. And they worked for the county for a while until that funding ran out. the band tried to look at how to enforce band laws, because now it had a government structure that was enacting laws. And so initially, they tried to have the game wardens, wildlife, parks, the natural resource department enforce band law. The Bureau of Indian Affairs said we couldn't do that because it was game wardens didn't have the authority to enforce criminal and civil laws of the band. And in fact, when we first started having game wardens, the county deputies tried to arrest the game wardens for impersonating police officers. And at one point, one of the officers actually had a county deputy come up, put a gun to him and said, "Give me your gun." And he refused to do it, which was commendable, but it was very concerning that that was going on. Then we tried to retrocede Public Law 280, and that got blocked, retrocession. And so that was something that probably will come up again at some point in time. Ultimately, the Bureau suggested we change the name of game wardens to rangers. They would be called rangers instead of like a park ranger, instead of like a game warden. And if you were a park ranger, you could enforce certain laws. And so we were exploring that, and then ultimately we developed a law enforcement agreement with the county. And that law enforcement agreement stayed in place where they recognized tribal law enforcement and county law enforcement and joint jurisdiction. In 1985, Art appointed me chief of police for the Mille Lacs Band. So for about 3 years, I was also acting as chief of police. It's very interesting in band statute, it says that the Commissioner of Natural Resources shall have no authority over the chief of police of the Mille Lacs Band. And I said, you can't really appoint me as chief of police because of band law that says I have no authority over the commission. As Commissioner of Natural Resources, I have no authority over the chief of police. And the legal department came back and said, that's really not a problem. Because when you're acting, you're either acting as chief of police or you're acting as Commissioner of Natural Resources. You can't do them both at the same time, so therefore you don't have any authority over one or the other. Which seemed like a crazy argument, but for 3 years that's what it was. Ultimately, we hired a fellow named Jim Banke, Flanders band member, and he was a trained police officer and took over the responsibility of law enforcement. I got on it. One example of how it worked when I was there was the county wouldn't really recognize tribal law enforcement. This was prior to the creation of the law enforcement agreement. But they would come and get me when they had problems. So one night about midnight, they came to me and said, we need you to come and find a kid. And so they had 6 squad cars. They threw me in the back of one of the squad cars, and there was a party going on, and they said, we think that kid is in that party. So they dropped me off on the street and said, go in there and see if you can find that kid. So I walked over there, and as I started walking over there, everybody was yelling, get out of here! You got no business here, blah, 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 blah. Everybody was pretty happy. They had a cake party going on, and there was a lot of yelling, and then they saw it was me. And they said, oh, Don, come and have a drink. I go, no, I'm not here to have a drink. I'm here to look for this child. And they said, well, we don't know. Go in the house and ask in the house. So I went in the house and, oh, Don, have a drink. No, I don't want to drink. I want to know where this kid is. Finally, somebody said, oh, he's down at so-and-so's house. So I walked back out, walked across the yard, down across to the street, got in the squad car, and said, go down here, check this house. So we went down there and checked the house, and sure enough, that's where the kid was. And we went back to the parking lot in front of the community center, and then these police officers all started in. I wish we had Claymore mines. Do you know what Claymore mines are? They were a device developed in Vietnam. Basically, it was a V-shaped thing that blew shrapnel out in all directions and mow down trees. It was so powerful. And we would show what Custer thought about arrow shirts, and it was just like crazy. These law enforcement officers bouncing all this craziness off. And I said, hey, nothing happened. Nothing happened. You don't need to act like that. I said, I don't want to listen to it. I want somebody to take me home. And I left. But, you know, this George Floyd stuff made me rethink all that stuff back, you know, there. If those guys would have had to act, what they would have done, you know. Pretty crazy behaviors that was out there. Anyway, we're getting through this. I don't know if you want to take a break or if we're good. Huh?
Sure.
Okay. Have a 10-minute break.